You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Zach Bechtold and Matt Franks. If you'd like to learn more about the Bearded Theologians, you can go online at beardedtheologians.com, where we have past podcasts, blogs, and a couple items for sale. So check us out, beardedtheologians.com. Thank you for listening, and enjoy this week's show. You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Matt Franks
and Zach Bechtold. And we have friend of the podcast and regular guest on, Reverend Matt Miofsky. He's the lead pastor at the Gathering UMC, and he just wrote a new book called Let Go. And Matt, man, thanks for being on.
Yeah, it's great to be back with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Always. Why don't you tell us a little? We'll just dive headfirst into it and tell us a little bit about Let Go and what's going on there and why you wrote it and what it is.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so I've written a couple books in the past, but for small group studies and like leadership books. But I really wanted to write a book that I could imagine, giving to my neighbor, just giving to anybody, regardless of how much they go to church. And so I tried to think of just sort of what's something that all of us have to struggle with. And I've noticed this. I don't know if you guys noticed this at your church, but every time I've had the chance over 13 years at the Gathering to meet literally thousands of new people who decide to walk through the doors of a church for the first time. And people come to church for all sorts of different reasons, but one commonality I've found is usually people walk through the doors of a church for the first time because something has changed in their life and they're trying to figure out how to deal with it. Yep. So maybe they've gotten married, they've gotten a divorce, they have had a baby, or they've lost someone they love. They are moving to a new place, or, getting ready to move off to somewhere new. I mean, something has changed and they're trying to figure out how to make sense of kind of a new reality in their life or how to navigate that change. And so I thought, I've had so many conversations about that with people over the years. I decided I want to write a book that my hope is it's almost like a little field guide for people who are trying to navigate change in their life, whether it's change that they've chosen or change that's thrust upon them. Because I've really come to believe that, we have to deal with change. That's a given. But we can either see change as a negative, as something to resist, or we can see it as an opportunity for growth. And I think the people who see it as an opportunity for growth just end up living more faithful and fulfilled lives. And so that's really what the book is about. Like, how do we see change as an opportunity for growth instead of resisting it?
Go ahead, Matt.
So as I was reading through the book, I definitely got that sense of that, and I love that this is a deal. Your intention was to be able to hand to your neighbor, because I was thinking, man, I've got a neighbor that probably needs to hear this. Some things in here, as I was reading through it, and there's one little line in here where you wrote that trust unlocks the door to the next stage of the journey, and thinking about kind of where we are in the sense of the church is that in order for us maybe to take some of those next steps, that we need that trust to really be able to do the next thing, or to move in that next direction. And as you were writing this, what was something maybe that you learned that you'd be willing to share that you couldn't put on paper?
Yeah.
Or you didn't put on paper, I guess.
Well, I think, in reference to what you're talking about with trust, I imagine there's other people listening that are like this. Like, I'm such a logical type thinker. I like to have a plan. I like to chart out, what it is that I'm going to do. And if I'm going to take a risk, I think a lot of us are not by nature risk takers, especially when it comes to our lives, our work, or our families. I mean, we kind of play it safe. And I think to some extent, that's how human beings are. We strive for stability and security in the midst of a world that's pretty chaotic. And there's some good things about that, but the downside is, we can resist change simply because it's different, and it cuts against security and stability. And as a planner, I like to know that if I'm going to leave behind one thing, that I know exactly where I'm headed or what the result is going to be. And I don't want to step out until I know that if I step out, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Well, the problem is most of the things in life and in the church aren't like that. We don't know what's going to happen if we make a decision or take a risk or try something. we have to try it first and then we find out. And so I think for a lot of us, it keeps us sort of stunted. It keeps us stagnant because we're too scared. So trust comes in because sometimes you have to take the next faithful step without knowing where the journey is going to lead you, but you have to take the next faithful step, and then God reveals kind of the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step. So that's how it's worked in my life. I never knew exactly where it was that God was leading me. I suspect if God would have shown me the whole path, I would have said, yeah, no thanks. But God just revealed the next step. So I think we have to trust enough just to take the next step, even if we can't see where everything is going to go. And I think that's a particularly important word for church leaders right now. I mean, I see kind of in the midst of all the uncertainty in the greater church, a kind of hunkering down mentality amongst a lot of people. Well, I don't want to do anything right now or make any big decisions right now because I don't know what's going to happen in the future. And I don't think that's a great way to lead a church.
Yeah, no, that's so I've in 15 years I've served in 4 conferences now, in various capacities, and so still having friends in all of those conferences, as we go through this in the Methodist Church and all the conversations we're having, there's very much of that either or. Folks are either going, okay, here's how we prepare and build trust and make a way for that next step, and faithfully take a step forward. And then there's no really little in between of maybe, right? But there's a whole lot more of, well, we're going to hunker down and just just maybe not do anything, and it's fascinating that we do that as people. But for me, it's really fascinating as the Methodist Church, because it seems like we're always in a season of change because we're itinerant, because we have these general conferences, because we have all of these things that promote a system of change, right? That we rarely get stagnant in our pastors, whether we stay 3 years or 10 or 20 years, we know that there's that reality that one day we'll move, and everything that we have throughout the social principles and the discipline promote moving forward and changing and creating space in this world that we live in for that. And yet we push back on that so much and go, oh, well, we've never done it that way.
Well, in the churches, I think, the state of the Methodist Church right now is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So much is changing. And like you said, there are people who see that as fundamentally disconcerting, scary, unstable. And so what they do is they hunker down, they stick their head in the sand, they hope that it just gets figured out, and they don't want to emerge until there's greater clarity. And so they're not going to do anything. And I see conferences doing this. They're not starting new churches because why start something new and we don't know what's going to happen. I see this with pastors. Why, launch a new initiative, or if we're not sure what's going to be going on. We see this financially. People don't want to give, or churches don't want to spend money because of all this. And so there's just this stagnation. And then there are people on the other side, I don't think as many, but some who see all the uncertainty in the greater church is actually an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the church maybe to witness to something different, to reach people we haven't reached before, to spark creativity and innovation, because we're going to need to be different in the future. And, my hope is that more leaders would see the times we're in as actually an opportunity for much needed reform of the Methodist Church, for creativity and innovation. I'm not scared of the instability in the greater church. I think we've needed it for a long time. I'm not saying this to be pessimistic, but listen, the United Methodist Church has never grown since its existence. I mean, we started in 1968. We've declined every year. And yet I see so many people so nervous and scared that somehow what we have is going to disappear or is going to have to change radically. And I'm over here saying, I'm a data person, man. I've looked at, every year, think about that. every year we've declined in membership since 1968. So why not embrace a season where we have to figure out a radically new way to do ministry? Right. So I think that this is actually an opportunity for us, but we can't face it with fear. And that's really what the book is about. And how do we do that? How do we navigate that?
Right. Well, and I love that. That's something that I have, that question. I've had 80, 90-year-old folks who have, my churches and on all over the place talking about this of, well, I was born a United Methodist. No, you weren't. You've been a United Methodist the last 50 so years. Oh, okay. And begin to frame it in the history of who we are as Methodists and where we started, how we got here, and the splits and the coming together that have taken place over the last couple hundred years, that have culminated in the last 50 of being United Methodist. And framing it around that whole idea is, how is this change coming up before us an opportunity for growth, just like these were? Are they painful? Sure, they can be. But how do we take that and trust each other to find that there's an opportunity here, no matter what happens, that there's an opportunity for growth? And like you say, we've not grown in the last 50 years. It's been a steady decline. And so how do we find ways to turn that around, that are,
well, let's not
that aren't
grieve too much the loss of something that has not worked. And let's embrace the possibility that God can create something that might be more effective. And, we're talking about church, but I really want to take it back down. The same thing is true in our lives. I mean, you don't have to be a pastor or a church leader to get this, right? I mean, just in a much, much closer to home, I'll take like job uncertainty, which plagues my congregation. And I'm sure both of your congregations as well. Either job dissatisfaction or job uncertainty. And there's so many people in my congregation who are either not doing what they want to be doing. Maybe they lost their job. They want to find a new job, and you get scared because this is your livelihood. This is your money and this kind of thing. But, and so oftentimes people will simply stay in something they don't like simply because to change opens up too many unknowns.
Right.
And I've met with people who for 10, 15, 20 years have done something they hate simply because the fear of the uncertainty of opening it up. And, you see this most clearly when someone loses their job, which is awful. I don't want to minimize that. But oftentimes it's also what forces them to have to think about something new. And in many cases, if you check in with them a year, 2 years, 3 years later, they'll often reflect back and say, hey, losing that job was actually the best thing that happened to me. Right. Not because it wasn't painful, because it forced me, right, to try to figure out something new. And I'm actually a better, stronger, and happier person now that I've gone through that. And so I think that, I think that's going to be true for the church, but it's true for us just as individuals, that change comes oftentimes at first like a loss, and it's scary and it hurts. But if we have the kind of steadiness and the faithfulness to work through it, we often look back and that change becomes like a defining moment for us.
Right. Working in 3 rural communities, 1,600 people, 350 people, 150 people are in my 3 communities. They have all embraced that change differently. My larger community is looking at it and going, hey, we've declined over the last several years, and that's really, really scary. But how do we begin to invite people in? How do we invite people to say, hey, come run your business here, your home office out of here, move here, it's cheaper, those types of things where my smaller communities have done that in a sense. One of them has, and they've lost their school. It's the bar, the church, and the co-op in town.
Right.
And the one in between is in that really weird place of, oh no, we're okay, but they've lost all of their. They don't have a grocery store anymore. They have a gas station and a couple of churches, and they still have the school, but they're hanging on to that. Oh no, we're not declining. We're not declining. But no, we are in some ways. And so how do we begin to look at that and say, how do we change and answer those questions? And it becomes a really scary, unsettling conversation to have to admit, oh, here's our reality, right?
Yeah.
And like you say, you embrace that now, and you look back on it in a few years and go, oh, that was really, really hard, but it was the best thing we did to embrace that and move forward.
Well, yeah, and the truth is, people are innovate and are the most creative when their backs are against the wall.
When they have no other option.
Reality. You don't want to go into crisis to do that, but
right.
If we can just remember that, it can mean that these times of great change also will be the seed beds of creativity and innovation on a personal level, and I think on a larger scale.
Yeah.
That's definitely. I was thinking about this, like, man, I'm just gonna play this video next Sunday for for the sermon, and we'll just this is kind of what I was going to talk about. It seemed like along the lines I want to talk about of not being afraid of moving forward, because we do get stuck. And our district superintendent, we met with our new DS on Tuesday, and he talked about. He said, we celebrate the past, and we get stuck there, and we spend too much time on there. We spend a little bit of time thinking about the present and where we're at, and we don't spend any time looking at the future and envisioning what that could be. And we really need to flip the script on that and not worry about our past, celebrate it, but not get stuck in it, and work not only to sustaining our present, but moving forward, but continually being on that visioning and looking forward, and understanding that that's going to be an unknown. And it's amazing to think about. And I've been thinking about, when the district superintendent calls you and says, hey, Matt, we've got this new opportunity for you to serve, and you have that anxiety, like, oh gosh, like, I really like it here. It's really comfortable, but I really need to step out, because that's what I ask our people to do all the time.
Yeah.
And what this may mean for me and my family and all that stuff. And that whole trust in God that God's going to, help you in that next step and that next step and that next step. And it's kind of cool in the sense of, we'll use a good Methodist term of prevenient grace, when you look back and you see, wow, God was with us even though we were struggling to make that decision. God was inching us and helping us towards that next step. And then those times of struggle, whether it's a loss of job, friends, family, whatever it is, just that willingness to take that next step. And I'm sure we all have seen it with people that are grieving. It's getting them to take that next step. And then once they take that next step, they feel confident and they can take that next step and then moving forward versus being stuck. And sometimes we just find ourselves just stuck.
Yeah. In the book, I use the Exodus story as really not only an example of how God led his people through change, but really as kind of a template for what holy change looks like in all of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
So for people who may not be as familiar with the story, the Exodus story has 3 phases. It's leaving Egypt, which I say is leaving home, even though home was miserable. It's entering the wilderness, and it's claiming the promised land. And what I do is I say, really this corresponds to what change looks like in our lives. Change starts when we have to leave behind something that feels like home. It feels secure and stable, even if it's bad. Remember, the Israelites, they were a little bit afraid to leave Egypt, even though they were slaves there, even though they had prayed for 400 years for God to do something different.
Right.
But it actually started to happen. It was scary because they were leaving behind at least a known quantity, even if that was awful. And we do the same thing, right? We stay in things that we hate or that we don't like simply because it's kind of that saying, what is it? The devil you know versus the devil you don't.
Right.
So the first stage of change is leaving something behind, having the courage to leave it behind. And the corresponding fear, of course, is the fear of loss, the fear of uncertainty. The second stage is the wilderness. And the wilderness, I think all of us can identify with that. That's that in-between time where you've left one thing behind and you can't really go back, or you don't really want to go back, but the future is still uncertain. You don't know where you're going either. And so you're stuck kind of in between, and you don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know what direction you have to go. You're not even sure if you're going to survive it. And the temptation here is to just turn around and run back to home or to the old reality. And I see people do this all the time. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I shouldn't have done this. Maybe I'll die out here in the wilderness is what the Israelites said. and then the final stage is kind of claiming the promised land, and that is like actually living into the future. And you would think this would be the easiest one, but of course the story goes that when the Israelites got up on the bank of the Jordan, they essentially peered over into the promised land and said, that looks scary. I don't know if we have what it takes. I don't know if we're ready yet. I thought that's what we wanted, but maybe maybe we're not quite there yet. And so they circled around for 40 years in the wilderness because they were really scared to live into the future. And so I think that's true of a lot of us as well, that we get right up on the cusp of something new that maybe we've been praying for, we've been looking for, been working for, but then when it's finally there, when it's kind of do or die time, we find all sorts of reasons why, well, maybe now's not quite the right time. Maybe I'm not quite ready. Maybe I haven't quite done enough discernment, and we circle around. And so that's really what that's kind of the structure of the book is, what's it like to leave home? What's the promise and the fears associated with that? Same thing in the wilderness, and same thing when it comes to claiming a new reality, the promised land.
Yeah, I love that. So I'm super into imagery because I'm a visual person.
Yeah.
Hence all the Jesus behind me, right? Parachute guy.
Yeah.
Love that. Love that. And just that idea to let go of, this is jumping out of a plane, right? This perfectly fine airplane. Gonna hop on out. Yeah.
Well, and that's, we were looking for just kind of what does it feel like sometimes to step out, to change. And I think for a lot of people, it feels like jumping out of an airplane. You think it's going to be a rush, but there's a lot of fear, man. And the chute's not open. You don't know exactly where you're going to land. And I mean, the whole thing. But the basic premise in the book, and I think it's the first sentence in the book, is like, you got this. Like, you can do this. Whether it's changing a relationship that is not good in your life, changing a job that is just not fulfilling or purposeful or right for you, whether it's changing some social network, whether it's changing some way that you're living your life. For a lot of addicts, it's just deciding to leave behind a life that was dependent on drinking or drugs. I mean, any of those things feel scary because you're leaving behind something that you've kind of cobbled together that works for you. But the whole premise of the book is it's worth it. And God really does have a better reality if you'll trust God enough to step out of where you are and towards something new.
Right. And that's so much what we see in any of our communities, any of our churches, or people are hanging on to those things that are super comfortable and sometimes really unhealthy, whether it's relationships or behaviors or addictions, but we just can't let them go.
Well, I think addiction is one that, of course, plagues so many people who might be listening, or at least people we know and love. And it's a perfect example of one of those things where it's not good. It's like Egypt. It's a slavery of sorts. Nobody wants to be addicted to drugs or alcohol. And yet the idea of giving those things up to those of us who've struggled with it, or to people who have family members who've struggled with it, it's scary to them. The first thing is like, I don't know if I can live or cope or deal without this stuff. Right. And so I'll take this, even though I know it's not good for me. I'll do this because I'm scared of what leaving this behind is going to be like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man.
Some good words to think about. Matt, we thank you for your time, and thanks for coming on with us and having a conversation with us about your book and other things. And for those of you who are looking for the book, it's Let Go. It's got a really cool little cover on it. Pick it up wherever you can find books, and wherever you buy books, whether it's a digital book or a physical book. And so for the Bearded Theologians, I'm Matt Franks.
I'm Zach Bechtold. Thanks for checking us out.
We hope you've enjoyed the conversations that we've had today on the Bearded Theologians Beardcast, and we'd encourage you to continue those conversations online at beardedtheologians.com or on our Facebook page. We also hope that you pick up a couple of coffee mugs to satisfy your coffee mug collection. Have a good day.